Today we have on Dr. Matthew Hicks to talk about psychedelic therapies, mental health, and the role of naturopathic healing within these areas. Welcome to the Herbal Hour Podcast.
Thank you.
So to start off, can you tell the audience a little bit about how you found yourself on this very interesting path?
Yeah. So for me, let's see, how far back do I go? I always was attracted to solving big picture problems, I guess. And at some point, as a young person trying to decide a career for myself, I got attracted to natural medicine. At first, I didn't even know naturopathic medicine existed. So I started off in chiropractic school. But I dropped out as soon as I learned about the existence of naturopathic medicine while I was there, and jumped ship. And then, what happened over time is I was in a romantic partnership at the time where my partner had some mental health stuff going on, which she didn't recognize as mental health. It was somatic things were coming up. Her physical health would sort of degrade as her stress levels went up. And I noticed this and saw this like firsthand, that the mind and the body were connected, right? And I found that to be fascinating and also very difficult to live with in a partner, and that eventually ended. But that was sort of where my interest originated. And then throughout the course of med school, I knew that I wanted to specialize in mental health. I did from the beginning. I was also in a master's program for medical research, and my projects that I did there, I did one project in mindfulness as sort of an open placebo almost. Became really interested in the placebo effect and how that's sort of the accusation made at a lot of alternative medicines that it's all a placebo. And I thought, like, well, even if it were a placebo, why shouldn't we like maximize that if it helps? And so I started to think of like, well, meditation sort of is a way of intentionally changing your mindset about something, and it's so, in that sense, it's sort of like an open placebo. And David Kapchuk's study came out about where they were treating IBS with a placebo, an open placebo. They were telling people it was a placebo and it still worked. And I just found that fascinating. So I did a study, or a secondary data analysis with some research at Oregon Health Science University there. And that got published on the expectancy effect in some mind-body trials. And that was interesting to me. And then I went on to do my thesis work on empathy and burnout in medical students, specifically naturopathic medical students, and really enjoyed that process. And also, while in those two programs, for a while I was in a third master's program in mental health, and I got through about about a third of that program before I realized that I didn't really need to have 3 graduate degrees to do what I wanted to do.
Right.
And in fact, it was maybe a slightly a detriment to my own well-being. So I dropped out of that program, but I learned a lot of good things from it, and it was a good program, and learned some good counseling skills and whatnot. And then somewhere in the mix there, I at a Grand Rounds lecture given by Erica Zelfand, another fantastic naturopath. She gave a Grand Rounds lecture on summarizing psychedelic research in there, and already having this interest in mental health, kind of thinking like, okay, how do I specialize in mental health? How am I going to do this? And then she gave that, and that was like news to me. This was before Michael Pollan's book came out. It was like it was out there in the world. But I hadn't caught on to it yet. And so that blew my mind. I was, a just say no kid, goody growing up, never touched any drugs whatsoever. And so I became fascinated. I went to the MAPS conference in Oakland in 2017, and just kept reading and reading and reading. I've gone to like 4 other conferences since then. and it sort of culminated in me applying and getting into, and now I'm about halfway through the psychedelic assisted therapy training program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And like we were talking, I am rolling out a ketamine assisted psychotherapy clinic here in Portland that will start in maybe late June, early July is when we're hoping to have a physical location. So yeah, that about brings it up to current times.
So you mentioned something about the placebo effect, which I find very interesting, that typically alternative practices are labeled as, oh, well, that's just the placebo effect. Even if the results show that it actually benefited the patient, it's kind of, taken out of the data as, oh, well, that's just the placebo effect. But I too was and still am very interested in studying that, like, in and of itself as a phenomenon that we don't understand, and trying to harness it. And this comes into the conversation of psychedelic therapies, because a lot of the tradition of use of psychedelics have to do also with the ritual aspect. So the practitioner, actually, it's interesting in those traditions because the practitioner themselves takes the psychedelic, and then they they do some kind of ritual incantation, whereas in these times a lot of the psychedelic experience is a personal thing that the patient themselves goes through it. So there's kind of differing opinions on who's actually supposed to take the psychedelic in the ritual therapy. I'm sure you've heard of those aspects. So how do you think the placebo effect can be utilized for healing, or what have you learned about the placebo effect? Because that's kind of this catch-all term.
Yeah. So to say a little bit more about the study that I did, we did three. It was based off data, pre-existing data from 3 clinical trials. One was veterans with PTSD, another was healthy older adults, and then the third one was older adults who were caregivers for people with dementia, so a very stressed out group of people. And they all went through MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is a very regimented mindfulness protocol that's given over the course of like 8 weeks. And the data I did was pretty simple. There was a lot more involved in all those trials. But what I did is I looked at this expectancy questionnaire they were given before they entered the study. And it was basically questions like, do you think this therapy works? Do you feel like this therapy works? Would you recommend it to a friend? Do you expect it to work for you? And so it kind of gave us the a Likert scale of how optimistic versus skeptical they were about going through this. And then I just did a simple correlation analysis with their perceived outcomes afterwards. So it's like, are you less stressed? Are you, more, peaceful or calm or whatever? It's been a while. I don't remember the exact terms we used, but and what we found was there was actually no correlation. And what's interesting about that is in a normal study, if you were just doing a blood pressure medication, right? You're going to get a slight placebo effect. People think they're taking a pill that's going to lower their blood pressure. Maybe that alleviates some of their worries, and their blood pressure goes down just because of the psychological component. But in this case, part of my interest in going into it was that meditation is all about changing your mindset, right? It's being mindful, whereas the opposite of mindfulness is sort of just your automatic thinking process is always happening. And so when you cultivate mindfulness approach through a meditation practice or for whatever mindful practice, you're changing the way you think. And so you can be skeptical about it going into it, or you can be optimistic thinking this is going to work. But if you go through the protocol, you actually do it, you'll more likely to find that it does work. And there are people obviously it didn't work for, but on average, people got benefit from it. And so it's a little bit different than with psychedelic. And this is a big criticism in the psychedelic research, because the sort of standard model is everything needs a placebo-controlled trial. Well, you can't really do a placebo in psychedelic research because people know they're either tripping or they're not.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to
those
fake
cases.
that.
Yeah, well, to some degree, some of the trials have tried. They'll give people like Ritalin or something, and if they're going with people who are drug naive, meaning they've never done a psychedelic, they don't know what it's like to trip. Then there might be some sort of blinding effect to that, but they're also like telling people what to expect about it. So if they're not actually tripping, they're not seeing things, having visions and whatnot, they eventually they figure out, okay, I didn't get the LSD. And it doesn't last as long, and so it's really difficult to do a blind trial in that sense. And then what you were saying was interesting about the shamanism part too. And in a lot of the traditions, particularly like ayahuasca traditions, it was like you said, it's the shaman takes the psychedelic and does their sort of energetic work under that influence. And the sort of framework being is that they are accessing the spirit world and can see the energies surrounding you and do the clearing work that needs to be done for you, as opposed to our approach was like you take in the medicine and the medicine does things to you. And in that model, it's sort of reversed in a way. But how those two relate in terms of placebo, it's I don't know that I see. I think there's not much of a placebo effect, other than to say that it does take some intention to do healing work with these substances. Which you've probably heard this said a million times, but anyone can just like take a bunch of acid at a rock concert and they don't become enlightened from that. But someone who does it with a guided therapist or in a healing ceremony or that's, I mean, they could even do it alone, maybe in their basement or something, but to really get benefit from it, it's the intention, set and setting have a profound influence on the benefits that come from it. So it's not just the drug.
Yeah,
and I mean, I guess someone could perceive their benefits coming from something other than just the drug itself. But I think that's what's unique about psychedelics, is that it's all about the experience. So in a way, it doesn't even matter if you took some substance that didn't even make you trip, and you feel better for it. Is that because you're having a placebo effect, or because the experience of going through the emotional effects of expecting a trip and not getting one, or having a mild one or something? It's the experience is what matters, and that's what all the research and these substances are showing, is that the experience is the healing. It's not just the drug. The drugs, they cause some neuroplastic effects in your brain, and we have all these imaging studies that kind of explain the mechanism of what's going on, but they don't necessarily explain the healing part of it, and they certainly don't explain why they have such long-lasting effects in a lot of people. Yeah. So there's what's going on is that you're having a different way to access some therapeutic work that's really powerful.
I think that's the key thing about psychedelic therapies, is that they're really about the experience that the person goes through. So everyone really knows of a case where, they sat down, they maybe were having a hard time, and they reflected on their life, and they came to some kind of insight, and then that insight led to some action. And then, 5 years later, they stopped doing this or they started doing that. And it all started from them having kind of like a heart-to-heart with themselves, struggling with an issue, maybe having some anguish around it and trying to find a solution. So that experience actually changed people's lives. Now, when you add in a psychedelic, it's like throwing jet fuel into whatever it seems that insight mechanism is, because of how open it puts the mind and how it changes our perspective from the more they call default mode network, that unconscious way of living, to being conscious, where the actual journey that the person experiences through their own mind is what is healing about the experience. It's not necessarily the chemical constituents, although there is some good argument to be made that there are some changes going on in neurochemistry, obviously, because of the psychedelics effects, and maybe they even have lasting effects on how the brain works, how that all functions. But it's the experience and the realizations that the person has that they're not caused by the psychedelic, they're brought forward by it. Like they might be something that was like deep in the person's psyche that they weren't consciously exploring. Maybe it was like a trauma from their past that they didn't even know was bothering them anymore. But then when they enter that psychedelic space, all of a sudden it's like blinders off and there's no way to run from that issue. So they almost like find a way through it. And then what they learn from that experience carries on way after the actual trip aspect ends. So I think it's a good point, that experience.
Yeah. And that's going to be, some people's experience, and it's not going to be everyone's too.
That's right. I mean, some people just take
some people
at a rock concert.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I even in people who are showing up with, to do real therapy work and have good intentions, and maybe they get some benefit from it, and then their depression comes back. That happens too. So I don't want to overhype these substances too, like they're some miracle cure that are going to solve all your problems, and then you are just this perfect enlightened being for the rest of your life. Life is still hard. Integrating the experiences is hard. You have to learn hard lessons in the process, and that's what they're good at doing. And an analogy I kind of like for how they work, and you brought up the default mode network. What the default mode network does is it sort of is it's responsible for several things. One is thinking about the past and predicting the future, right? So sort of mental time travel is the term they use for that. But it also it kind of is the conduit for sensory perceptions, and results in sort of like taking things in different sense. Like I'm sitting in a chair, I can feel these things, I can smell stuff. It takes all these sensations and kind of like constructs an image of the self and how we relate to the world, right? And so with all these things going on, that can sometimes become really rigid. And you'll notice this if you hang out with enough super depressed or super anxious or obsessive compulsive people, is that there's a rigidity to it, to their experience. And this isn't, it's not the same as someone who's, going through a breakup and they're sad for a while, but people who are, really chronically depressed, they get really stuck in that storyline that they have, and every feeling becomes a rumination, and they might find a story. And I think the human brain is really good at coming up with some rational explanation for our feelings. And I'll even share a personal experience with this. I went through a divorce several years ago, and after a while I started taking St. John's wort to sort of just help me through the winter, basically. And it was great. It was super helpful. I although I didn't fully appreciate how helpful it was until I decided to quit cold turkey, which I don't advise. I was still in school at the time and didn't know any better, I guess. But anyway, I quit taking it, and about a week later, it just like hit me, and I just was like irrationally sad. And I didn't know why. I was just like, I'd be like crying out of nowhere, and the natural thing to do is to come up with a story about why you're sad. And so I felt myself going through this process, like, oh, I'm sad because of my ex-wife, blah 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 blah. And it's like, well, actually, that's not. It just didn't fit right? And so I came, eventually it clicked, like, oh, you stopped taking the St. John's wort. And it was like this process of like, oh, sometimes emotions are just the results of or our stories can get caught up in the emotions in this sort of weird cycle. But my point in saying that is, we can get stuck in those stories, and then when we have emotions, we get wrapped up in the story again. And the default mode network is sort of what keeps us in those storylines. And so what psychedelics do is they interrupt the default mode network, which is that sense of self. And that's why in sort of the psychedelic experience, you lose sense of time, and you also like get crossing of sensory experiences, and and it's sort of like a reboot. You come out of that experience and it's like, whoa, that rigid story I was stuck to has just been shuffled around for a bit. Now it might come back in time, but it's been disrupted. That cycle has been disrupted. And now I can start to see things differently. I can start to weave a different story if you do that work, right? Now, if you just do it at a rock concert and you go back to the same routine the next day, maybe you didn't accomplish very much. But if you're doing that in a therapeutic context, it's like a reboot. Anytime your computer, your phone starts acting funky, sometimes a reboot like gets it working again. And that's sort of what psychedelics do really well.
You bring up a fascinating point about the kind of rationalizing process that happens in response to how we feel. And I always find that pretty amazing, that my experience of it is that I'll be feeling in a certain mood, and then thoughts will come along that are associated with that mood. But when that mood changes, the thoughts are different. So it's almost like our minds is trying to interpret our experience, but it's after the fact. Like, so if one feels that they're having these negative thoughts, it's really easy to just become aware of, oh, it's because I'm in a negative mood, and maybe do some kind of self-care practice, meditation, or some kind of reflection to get out of that place. And then all of a sudden the thoughts are just positive now. So the thoughts are not really controlled by us, which is really fascinating. As somebody who's also interested in Buddhist philosophy, I think that's one of the profound insights of meditation.
Yeah, you're right on track with what I was just about to say. It's anyone who's done enough meditation will have this experience at some point, where if you get really good at observing your thoughts, at some point you realize, oh, thoughts just happen. They're like things that happen to us in a way, and through cultivating a meditation practice, you get to be just that observer, and that's a fascinating experience to have, and really gives you a level of insight and objectivity, and in my experience, it also is like just increased my capacity for empathy and compassion for people, who really get stuck in their story and their feelings, right? And if you're not able to sort of take a step back, and say, there is sadness, as opposed to I am sadness, or I am fear, or I am shame, or I am these things. When you've cultivated that sort of objectivity that comes from being the observer in a meditation state, you can just say, okay, this is arising, this is present for me now, but it's not who I am. It's not like where I have to be. It's not where I'm going to get stuck. And so that's really the goal of most therapy. Maybe they don't use those terms in the same way, but it's to be able to observe and witness those feelings and not get stuck in them.
Without that distance, that space, we become automatically identified with those thoughts, and we actually fall under the spell that it's us thinking them, meaning that they're our responsibility, and also meaning that if they're not positive, then that's like our fault somehow. And I think that's where a lot of suffering comes from, in addition to the already existing suffering of the world, is a resistance to that suffering or wishing it was different. Um, for example, everyone's had this experience probably where they're feeling in a down mood and they do everything they can to kind of uh, resist it, to get out of it. And when they're unable to, they put a lot of blame on themselves, and they put even more negative emotion of feeling like, why is this happening to me? Or, must have done something wrong, and adding all these layers of pain onto something that in and of itself was um, already painful. And I think psychedelic therapies are helpful in the sense that they open oneself up to all of that experience. But what's interesting about them too is you can have terrible experiences on psychedelics. In fact, that seems to be part and parcel of most experiences, at least for some period of time, because we don't have the usual, it seems, the defense mechanisms. So when like an anxious thought comes up, when you're just going about your day, we have all sorts of methods for like redirecting the minds, kind of like self-soothing it away. But when you're in that psychedelic space, it doesn't work. Like the more you push it down, it seems the more it comes up. And then that's when the spiral starts of that quote unquote bad trip of resisting your own mental experience, which adds so much fuel to the fire because you don't actually control much of your mental experience. You don't control like the clouds that move through the sky. And that's the symbol that's given in Buddhism for thoughts, that they're just clouds that move in the sky, and we're trying to, stop certain ones of them and make other ones, change.
Yeah. So there's a couple things, to say in response. I probably won't remember them all once I get going, but in relating to the, this challenging experience, the quote unquote bad trip, there is a need to surrender to the experience to really get a benefit from it. And I've seen people not do that well, both particularly in my experience with Zendo Project, which is a psychedelic harm reduction tent or service that's offered at festivals where people go through a little bit of training to be sort of sitters, calming presences for people who are going through difficult times. And so I did it at Burning Man several years ago. And people come in and a very common story is, I just was in this group of people. I just met them. They offered me some fill in the blank LSD, mushrooms, MDMA, whatever. And then, then I started to feel afraid. I started to feel paranoid. I realized I don't know these people very well. I don't know how much I just took. And they start to sort of freak out. And once they've gotten to that, once the fear has come up, then there's a resistance to the experience that comes up, and like, no, I don't want to do this anymore. But there's no eject button.
You can get off the ride.
There's nothing that really, I mean, you can take a benzodiazepine or something that is, kind of sedating, but it still doesn't really stop the experience from happening. So you're in for it. And that's when people show up at, a place like Zendo Project, which is a good thing that it exists, right? Because if they didn't, some people get, pretty obnoxious or scary or threatening sometimes because they feel threatened, right? And this happened at Burning Man at Zendo. Not to me, I wasn't the person who sat through him, but I heard this story. This guy who became convinced that his friends had fed him rat poison. They were trying to steal all his things, and he was just totally freaking out, right? And he came back the next day, and he was, and then that group of friends just kind of like dumped him off at Zendo Project. Like, we just want to go dance and have fun or be silly. And this guy was being a bummer on the rest
Yeah, it's accusing them of poisoning him. It's like, dude, you got to leave the group, man. You're killing the vibe.
So yeah, and he was kind of a big dude. So like, if he gets scared, he starts to like scare other people on it, unintentionally. But anyway, he comes back the next day and he tells the whole story, and he realizes, like, yeah, I shouldn't have engaged. I shouldn't have taken as much as I did. I shouldn't have done it with people I wasn't more comfortable with, and whatever. But he was enormously grateful for the safe space that was created for him at Zendo, where he just had a place to kind of chill and be kind of just watched by, a caring presence. But more to the point of the challenging experience is that there was one survey based study, and there's a lot of confounding issues with this research, so take it with a grain of salt. But it was done using people who volunteered information on, I think, Arrowhead or some other psychedelic database type website. But of the people who responded to the survey, well, it was all of people who had acknowledged having a bad trip, but about 80, I want to say it was 86, 87% of them said that they later viewed that quote unquote bad trip as a really positive experience for them, right? Because what happens is, like the example you gave, maybe some people are confronted with their trauma they had been suppressing, they've been putting into the back of their mind, they didn't want to deal with it. And now here they were forced to confront it, and if you resist, that sort of thing, it's going to be more and more challenging. The only good option, and the advice we always give people, is to just surrender to it, be curious about it. One of the teachers in the CIS program says, you see a skeleton, go see if it's ticklish. It's because the alternative doesn't work. To try to run away from it doesn't work, and it can make things worse, actually, if you just resist it the whole time and you just wait to sober up in that state of fear. And plenty of people have had, I mean, I hear this all the time. It's like, oh, I had one bad LSD trip, I'll never do a psychedelic again. And it's always the case that they were young and naive and took too much and didn't know the people that were, there was all these like bad settings involved. But those experiences can be really, really fruitful. And they can be somewhat prevented. I mean, even in a therapeutic setting and a safe place with a good therapist or guide or sitter, scary things can come up, challenging experiences can and do come up. I mean, I had one person one time who just wanted to have a fun time, and what came up was this sort of existential dread about the meaninglessness of life, and she didn't want to process that. She just wanted to be silly and laugh and see swirly things in the wall and whatever. But that resistance is like, it didn't really go away, and in that particular instance she chose not to submit to it and let it happen. And so a lot of her time she just like really felt nauseous, and like it was just kind of a miserable experience for her, unfortunately. But it can be useful though, to submit, to bring those things in, and it shows you stuff that's like that you didn't know you needed to address. It may not be the experience you want, but it's probably the experience you need to really do some good work.
Yeah, the advice to surrender seems so useful, but so difficult, actually, because in our day-to-day, we habitually, instinctually recoil from anything negative, any negative feeling, any negative thought. We have this feeling of like, no, I don't want to go into that. But in the psychedelic state, you realize your resistance to the thing does not actually make it go away. And then like your realization of that while you're already in that state, that kind of sets it off on this path of coming to terms with different sufferings that we might not be aware of. But what I've found for myself, what I found for myself and seen in those kind of experiences where at the moment of like greatest terror, when you think, oh no, I might just be like this forever. Because that's like the common fear, right? When somebody's in a bad trip, they think like, well, this is just me now. Like, that's just what I'm going to be like. I'm just insane now, which is a terrifying thought to have. But almost in the very second that like the experience is completely surrendered to fully, and not just like conceptually, but like, okay, well, this is what's happening. I just have to kind of fully accept it and let it go. Then that experience within seconds can be transformed into like the highest levels of bliss and gratitude and tears and love. And it just shows how close those things are to each other, that if we fully experience them without resistance, they have almost their opposite. Like the lesson, once it's learned, it shows you something really positive too. But so it's interesting when people just get into just a bad trip, because that means probably they were resisting it for like 6-7 hours straight, which sounds horrible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's like, and to bring it back to, Buddhist philosophy too, it's, the Buddha taught that, you can suffer a pain once or twice, and often people suffer twice because there's not only the cause of the pain, I think the example we gave was like being struck with an arrow, right? You've not only got the arrow, sticking out your arm or whatever, but there's also this sort of the emotional pain and suffering of
like, why is this arrow here? It's not
for
fair.
me. Why do I have this in here? Like I'm in pain. Like I'm miserable. There's all that, and you may not be able to take the arrow out, but you don't have to have the second arrow in, which is the sort of existential suffering that you're going through. That part of it is sort of a choice, and so by accepting that, like, okay, I've got this arrow in me, I've got this pain in my body, or this circumstance I don't like, or this thing I can't change, you can accept that, and it can just be what it is, and you can be more equanimous about it, or you can really just be wrapped up in a pity party around it, which is super easy to do, and it's a trap a lot of people fall in, and then we probably all have at some point in our life. We felt the urge to do that. And then what can happen sometimes too is people get really loyal to their suffering, and I see this too in the naturopathic world, and this kind of fits the profile I was talking about earlier, with that patient who's like really sensitive, the kind of hypochondriac, or they have a real legitimate thing too, health concern, a chronic health condition, but they get really caught in the story that, like, I am someone with chronic pain, or I am this person who always suffers, or I am or I've someone who's had some trauma in their past, and they're just like, they're always a victim, and they have a hard time changing that story, because and it's a defense mechanism to cope with the stress that put them in that situation originally, but then they get stuck and they stay there, and it can be really hard to get away from, because we become very loyal to our own suffering. But that's a choice that we can navigate away from, and mindfulness, meditation is one avenue to do that, and psychedelic therapy is another, and regular therapy too.
Right, especially psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. Now that's just combining all the best things together. That's a really good point, that the story is kind of what continues whatever that disease process, or that negative emotion, that continued story. And that seems to point towards why psychedelics can potentially be therapeutic, is because they almost open a window of what it looks like if you weren't just like sad old me, or like yourself. Like, what does life actually look like when you're there and present, and you're not living in a kind of story? So that's usually the most unpleasant aspect of psychedelic experiences for many people, is that sense of ego dissolution, where they feel like everything they thought they understood about themselves or who they were becomes very ephemeral and kind of starts slipping away. And then that's when that existential fear of death, annihilation, all that comes in, and that big resistance towards letting that happen, because there's no certainty in what's on the other side. But what's on the other side, in many cases, is actually peace, is actually living in a state where you're not focused on yourself, your problems, but you're just there. You're just part of the, experience, kind of flowing with it. And I think
Yeah.
that aspect itself is so therapeutic, just to have that one glimpse of like, this is a possible way of living.
Right. Yeah. And it's sort of, I think, one thing the Hindus got right, which I'm not Hindu or anything, but it's, everything is in cycles of death and rebirth, right? Over and over again. And I think it's true in life. And what, psychedelics do is they provide you, one of the many potential experiences you get with psychedelics is one of death and rebirth. Sometimes not all in one session. Sometimes it takes multiple to go through all the cycles, but sometimes it does happen that way. And to be, yeah. Well, let me just say that Stanislav Grof, who's a pioneer in this field and has probably done more psychedelic psychotherapy than anyone alive right now. He describes the perinatal matrices, he calls them, which is basically the psychedelic experience follows what he describes as 4 stages of labor. So there's the first state, which is sort of this oceanic bliss. You're just happy in your mother's womb, right? And everything's great. But it's dark and it's limiting, and you reach a point eventually where it gets cramped and uncomfortable. And then comes the second stage, which is the beginning of contractions. And right at that point, the cervix isn't open, so it's just compression. And that's the part where you feel like you're going to die. You're just going to be crushed by these contractions that are happening. And there's no escape. It's just like, it's dark misery, death, right? And then third stage eventually comes. The cervix opens. You're still being crushed. It's still painful. It's still hard, but there's literally a light at the end of the tunnel. And there's some sense that you're going to get through this. And then finally, the fourth stage is delivery, right? And you come through and you're free. And that's the rebirth phase, right? And now you're in your mother's arms. But you're also you're in a new experience. Now you have to breathe with your own lungs, and you have to eat food from external sources. You have to put stuff in your mouth, and then there's light for the first time. And so life is new. There's all these new sensations that are both scary and exciting, and so that it's a really beautiful analogy, and that's what we go through often in a psychedelic experience, and what we go through in life if we're really open to it.
Yeah, it's interesting how typical, actually, at least the stories I've heard of those kind of death and rebirth processes, how they almost seem to be an aspect of how the psyche heals itself in some sense, just as the body has all these mechanisms for homeostasis, so too does the mind have these mechanisms of when pressure becomes so intense and adaptation is so necessary to the external environment, it almost has to have some kind of experience in it. I wanted to ask you, so you do psychedelic integration with patients. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that is and how that process works? How do you help somebody who's gone through a psychedelic experience pull that wisdom out of it? Because it's not, although the experience of itself is healing, many of the lessons are kind of forgotten in the sense that they are only real when you apply them in your daily life and actually change those habits of thinking, living, etc.
Yeah. So just to be clear as well, I don't do any psychedelic work with people because they're still illegal. Mm-hmm. But for those people who are going to use psychedelics anyway on their own, if they want to come talk to me about their experience afterwards, like maybe the day after or something, then I'm happy to sit with them and or sit on a computer in front of them. And talk to them about what their experience is. And so integration is really just recounting sort of what happened, and figuring out what it means to them. And it's not sort of an analytical thing where, a snake in the woods means X thing. It's just like helping them decipher by asking lots of questions about what it represented to them, what their background is, how it felt, that sort of stuff, just to really to make it a little more impactful. And that's what integration is it's bringing those experiences and learning the lessons we can learn from them and incorporating them into your life. How did you feel in that moment when that thing happened, or you saw that thing, or you were outside your body, or whatever. And how do we carry that forward so it's not just a vague memory in a drug induced moment you had once, but how does this actually change, or change who you are, or not change it? How does it remind you of who you really are at the core, or who you're becoming, or who you want to be? And how do we like make a plan moving forward to make that felt sense a more real sense, like presently in your life, like today?
Right, because when the effects of the psychedelic wear off, one is back into the same reality with the same patterns, with more of a knowledge or an insight of a different way to deal with them. But it still has to be applied. It doesn't necessarily, as you mentioned earlier on, fix all the problems, because the problems are always being generated on top of already existing. So you also mentioned to me that you do ketamine therapies. So I wanted to kind of dive into that topic because I'm not too familiar with ketamine's use as a therapeutic agent. Have heard some interesting things about it being used for really severe depression that doesn't work for anything. Rather, other pharmaceuticals, other management doesn't work for it.
Yeah.
So what is ketamine therapy, and how does it differ from the other psychedelics in terms of when they're used in a therapeutic setting?
Sure. So ketamine was developed in the 60s. So it was discovered in 62, went through the FDA process in 63 and got approved. But it got approved as an anesthetic, a general anesthetic. And the guy who, I'm blanking out on his name right now, but the guy who did the original research on it noticed that, okay, this kind of gives people a trippy experience. But, being in the 60s, and the pharmaceutical company who wanted a patent on it, they didn't want to be associated with psychedelics, which they weren't using the term psychedelics yet, but a psychotomimetic. They didn't want that label thrown on it because they were afraid of the stigma, or just the associations in general. And so they came up with this term, dissociative anesthetic, which at high doses, it makes you completely dissociate, which is why it's useful for surgery or something. If you're going to get some real invasive procedure you don't want to be conscious for, or don't want to experience the pain of, you get ketamine. And so it became really popular during the Vietnam War. It was known as a buddy drug because a medic could just like carry it around, pop it in, and you were good to get back to the hospital or whatever. And so now it's international standard drug used everywhere. It's very safe. It's used in pediatrics, and it's used in animals, and it's used in a lot of settings. It's a very useful drug. But what they found over time was that people who were using ketamine for other reasons, every so often, someone who is depressed, their depression would go away for about a week at a time when after their surgery. And they also noticed that people were occasionally reporting these sort of trippy experiences, or a reentry phenomenon, they call it sometimes, after the anesthesia was kind of wearing off, say like after a surgery or something. As they were becoming more and more conscious, they would reach basically a serum level of ketamine in their blood, which was more in that psychedelic range, right? Because real high, it just knocks you out. Real low, it's just kind of a mild pain relief. But then somewhere in the middle, it'll give you like a psychedelic experience. And for the unprepared, these were sometimes really scary, um, because they're psychedelics. They don't know they're going to happen. Sometimes people have like all the things we've talked about up to this point. The demons get released, and if you're not ready for that, then it's not so good. And so, but they started to do a little bit more research on it, and in the 90s, the National Institute of Health, part of the NIH, or the National Institute of Mental Health, excuse me, part of the NIH, said, hey, let's research this as a psychiatric medication. And so they did a bunch of clinical trials for people who were depressed, and but their approach was to do it basically the same way they do it for surgery, which is they just put an IV of ketamine in you. You sit there until it's done dripping, and then you go home, basically. I mean, you sit there until if you're not, tripping or something, but your depression goes away for about a week at a time. And they said, yep, that works. But at that point, it was off patent. And so there wasn't much money to be made, from the pharmaceutical companies. So it never even went through the full FDA process to be approved for that use. And so what has happened is, over time, basically, doctors, mostly in private practice, that have known about that use, have been opening ketamine clinics up ever since, offering it for treatment-resistant depression. And people, that's what they do. They just come in, they get an IV of ketamine on a semi-regular basis, and their depression temporarily leaves them. But it always comes back.
Mm.
And somewhere along the lines, and I forgive me for not knowing the names off the top of my head, but people said, hey, what if we did this in a more psychedelic therapy model? And they do it like they do any other psychedelic therapy. You have the experience, and then you have counseling kind of before and after, and they found that to be really useful. And then there's also, you can even modify the dose a little bit within that psychedelic range, where on one you have sort of the real trippy end of things, where we talk about the K-hole, which is people having really deep spiritual psychedelic like experiences. And then there's more of what we call a psycholytic dose range, which is a smaller dose where people are still able to sort of be conscious and report what's going on. And so you can do therapy under the influence of ketamine, and do it more similar to like maybe how MDMA is done, where it's sort of more empathogenic, and you can talk and without sort of the fear that might come up when discussing a trauma or whatever. And so those are sort of the different models that are used for ketamine therapy. And certainly, since all of this research has been kind of blowing up in media and in culture recently, around psychedelics in general, a lot of people have been saying, well, hey, ketamine's already legal. It's an off-label use, which means it's not technically approved by the FDA for the treatment of depression or anything, for that matter. It's just an anesthetic. But it's a Schedule III substance, so any provider who can prescribe a Schedule III substance, just like any other drug, they can use it off-label, which means they can write it for whatever reason that provider sees fit. And so a lot of people are doing that. That it also means insurance companies do not cover it when it's written off-label. So that's why a lot of people are, following the first ketamine model I mentioned, which is you just kind of show up and get an IV for a while, because then you just keep coming back for the drug, and that's a good business model. And the ketamine itself is super cheap. It's like maybe $2 to $4 per dose. It's very cheap, but you have to pay for the professional's time, right? And all the other expenses that come with a professional running a clinic, the costs of running business and whatnot. But then Janssen Pharmaceutical, which is owned by Johnson & Johnson, said, hey, we want to get in on this. And so they started developing Spravato, which is S-ketamine. So ketamine is a racemic molecule, meaning there's sort of two mirror image versions of it. Kind of if you think of like your left and your right hand, if you lay one on top of the other, you got thumbs pointing two different ways, but otherwise they're sort of mirror images of each other. Well, in the same way, ketamine has an R and an S version. And so they decided they found a way to, and this is a super common play that pharmaceutical companies use. They take some drug that they already know works, and they just say, hey, we'll take half of it, they'll patent it, and then they'll patent the other half later, or they'll find some slight variation where it's basically the same thing, but it's technically slightly different, and get a patent on it. So anyway, they did that with ketamine, and so Spravato is just S-ketamine. It's one half of the molecule, and they put it in this little nasal spray. And they went through the hoops of getting approved through the FDA to treat treatment-resistant depression. And so, if you jump through all the insurance companies' hoops, you can get Spravato treatment that is covered by insurance. Now, it's insanely expensive for Spravato where it's something like I want to say like $600-700 per dose. And in their protocol, you're doing that twice a week, every week, indefinitely until you decide to do it less often. But the model is to continue doing it. Maybe you do it once a week, and then you do it every other week or something. But there's only two dosing options, 56 or 84 milligrams. And you can get sort of, and I've done it a little bit with a few patients, and you can get sort of, you can get a little trippy on it. But it's not a strong psychedelic experience. In my approach, I tried to kind of maximize that. So I did, I had them wear a blindfold. We did sort of integration like work around it. I had a psychedelic music playlist going, and to try to really get the most out of it, and it worked really well. Actually, in the couple patients I've used it in, I've had one patient it didn't work so well in. We didn't give it maybe enough time to really work, but it may have just not been a good fit for that patient. But the other hang up about it is that the insurance model does not want to pay providers for the time that they spend doing it. So they cover the medication, which is, like I said, super expensive. So they don't want to pay for it, and they put up a lot of barriers to covering it at all, which means a lot of administrative costs. I mean, you're just faxing documents like crazy, and no provider wants to be doing that, spending their time on a fax machine. So that's part of it sucks, but it seems to work well. But it's also a 2-hour visit, because the ketamine lasts about an hour and a half. The sort of the dissociative effects of it, but they say it's a full 2 hours. Patients aren't allowed to drive afterwards, and you have to measure their blood pressure 3 times during the visit. It does cause a slight increase in blood pressure, so you want to have someone who's well managed blood pressure. It bounces up, maybe 10-15 points or something under the influence of ketamine. But they only will cover, the insurance usually will only cover the equivalent of a 15-minute appointment. So you can't do one-on-ones with people 2 hours at a time if you're only getting paid for 20 minutes. So you can do it in groups, you can find other ways to do it, but you don't really have time to get into deep psychedelic psychotherapy type work with Spravato. So I say all that just to say, to give it a fair shake. It is helpful. And the clinical trials show that. There's more I could go into about the criticisms of some of those clinical trials. There is reason to be a little bit skeptical that we got a little better picture of Spravato than is necessarily the God's truth, so to speak. But it seems to be safe. At worst, it seems to be safe, and it works well. So.
Do you see a future where mental health practitioners, psychiatrists use psychedelic therapies for various conditions, and maybe even use certain psychedelics for this condition and a certain other one for that one and a certain one for this issue, kind of like they do with SSRIs and antidepressants in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll get to a point. In fact, I have one colleague who's a retired therapist who kind of follow around. In fact, I talked to him earlier today. Who he's a fan of saying that, you know, someday it'll be malpractice to not use these substances on people because they're really effective. No, it's not for everybody, right? And there are certainly conditions that they will not be indicated for. But they are extremely helpful, and they each have their sort of different there are different experiences between the different substances. So I mean, the clinical trials right now, it's like MDMA for PTSD, psilocybin for depression, but I don't think it will necessarily always be as narrow as this substance, for that condition. I think you could certainly treat PTSD with psilocybin, and you could certainly treat depression with MDMA, and any way you kind of mix and match it around. What's really probably more important is the therapeutic relationship with your therapist. This sort of again, the setting matters a lot. And that being said, I also do think that, like, yeah, with certain patients, I might go more toward this substance, not so much based on what their specific diagnosis is, although that's probably the most important factor, but also like what their personality is like, what their sort of anxiety about being in an altered state of consciousness is. I may not start with a strong dose of LSD for someone's first ever experience, because that can be a bit much. For some people, ayahuasca is indicated when I get sort of the sense that someone really needs to purge. That's part of the ayahuasca experience. Is a lot of people physically vomit, but I mean, the purge can come in other forms, crying or whatever. But there's this sort of releasing that it's a very common experience, not always there, but and some people, for people who are going through like grief, maybe from a death or a divorce or some reason, it's great for that, but it doesn't mean that you can't treat anything with any of these substances. So yeah, it'll come down to experience and more research. Obviously, it's still very early days for this research, and there's still a lot of questions that remain. And yeah.
My biggest question, so if it ever does become legalized, I know there's what is it, the IP34 movement in Oregon. There's also the IP44, which are the IP44 is decriminalizing basically all drugs, and IP34 is specifically having psilocybin therapies as a legal approach, with practitioners who have to learn a certain program or something like that to go through with it. My biggest concern with the therapies is they have a tendency to spark things. So especially when you're working with like a mental health population, the biggest question is like, how do you know that the therapy will be helpful for that person and not make it worse for them? Because I guess that's the biggest worry with the psychedelics is they can put you in a bad spot, and somebody who's already in a bad spot. So what's your take on that, on how practitioners would go about selecting whether or not, this patient seems like a good fit, this one might be a little bit too high risk, and those kind of considerations? Like if somebody was in a psychotic episode, you obviously can't like do psychedelics. That's just a terrible idea. Or even if somebody's in like a manic episode, manic depression or something like that, or if they're severely suicidal. I mean, there's a lot of these considerations when you really take the psychedelic therapies to that kind of psychiatric level, where it's would be used at like a psychiatric hospital or something like that. So what is that? What would that be helped by for you? Is that more like set and setting things or patient selection?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things to be said of that. One is that, yeah, it is a concern, right? And at some point, something bad is going to happen. I guarantee it. Just as these substances get used more and more frequently, as they become legal, there's legal pathways to do it. Eventually, somebody is going to, uh, you know, run out of a therapy room and run into traffic or something. Something like that's going to happen. Um, and it'll be a setback for all of us. But those sort of things happen now. They happen a lot, and the rather small risk, I think, is worth the pretty great reward for what these therapies have to offer. But yeah, it is a concern, and specifically with IP34 here in Oregon, which would create these psilocybin service centers. It'll create basically a separate board that will create criteria for people who want to be psilocybin therapists, basically. And the criteria is that those people don't necessarily have to be professional therapists or doctors or anything. They can just get this certification basically coming from as little as a high school diploma, I think. And they'll get fully educated on the contraindications and whatnot, but the enforcement of that, I mean, that's always can be subtle. I mean, I mean, I'm a fairly well trained physician, and I'll have patients who, they won't tell me until their third visit that they're hearing voices, or that by the way, I was diagnosed with bipolar a long time ago and I don't take my meds. And because people, they don't like the labels of these, of stuff, and so it can be hard to screen for them. You only have so much time in an office visit to ask every possible question out there, and so you're kind of a little bit at a patient's mercy for them to tell you really the most pertinent information. And certainly you need to be diligent and screen for the the big stuff. And certainly if you're doing psychedelics, you would screen for things like bipolar and schizophrenia or any form of psychosis and whatnot. But yeah, so there's the need to be really careful about it. I think there's these two, there's more than two, but there's multiple discourses as to where we should go with psychedelics. The one discourse is that it's sort of the cognitive liberty approach, that we should all have access to whatever state of consciousness we want and any tools necessary to achieve those states. And these substances in various forms have always been with us. They evolved with us, probably before us in some cases. And right now we're in an era of our civilization where we have hid them and repressed them for so long that we aren't familiar with them. We don't have this sort of maturity as to how to deal with these substances in an appropriate way. And so if everything became legal tonight, probably a lot of people are going to go hurt themselves doing it, especially when there's so much good media on these substances now. Everyone with any sort of mental health complaint is going to think, well, I can just go do some psychedelics and things are going to get better. And then they're not going to get better for everybody, right? On their own. And so there's a case to be made, that just complete liberal decriminalizing could hurt a lot of people. I think my personal opinion is that that's where we should eventually go with it, because I do believe that nature should never be criminalized. It's kind of absurd that we can decide that something that grows out of the earth should be illegal.
Yeah.
That's just, it's sort of mind-boggling that we even attempt to construct a social paradigm around laws like that. But nonetheless, that's currently the way things are. And then how long it takes to get there, how do we mature as a culture around these sort of things? I don't have super good answers for that, other than to bring them out into the open and to talk about them and to do more research and to have encourage, more responsible use of them. And nothing ever gets good by hiding it. Just like on an emotional level, if there's something you're ashamed of, the cure to shame is to expose it. Tell someone about it. And maybe not the whole world, maybe not everybody, not someone who's going to use it against you, but you talk about it, and then once it's out in the open, it can't rot inside of you anymore. And in the same way, hiding and repressing psychedelics has not really done us any good. It's created more ignorance around them, and as a result, it's been used to harm a lot of people. And the war on drugs, to go on a little bit of a tangent here, it was largely a war on Black people in America, and other groups and ways of thinking that the people in power wanted to repress. And so there's a lot of negative associations around these substances for that reason, and they persist. And a lot of people are ignorant of that link, just because they don't know the history of it. I mean, there's maybe you've heard it, but there's this,
I have, yeah.
The tape of Nixon saying, how do we? I forget exactly what he says, but they're talking about locking up basically, Black people and the hippies.
Yeah,
people who did want to participate in the Vietnam War, and that was the way to do it. You can't criminalize free speech in any form, but all these people seem to have one thing in common, and it's drug use. So we'll make that illegal, and we can lock up all these people.
Cannabis, particularly.
Yeah, right.
Which is interesting because cannabis was used medicinally for quite some time, actually. The eclectic physicians and earlier physicians who used herbs in addition to pharmaceuticals, they used like cannabis tinctures, they used cannabis preparations all the time. It was just another thing in the formulary. It wasn't even anything that particularly interesting to them, although it had a lot of efficacy for the things it was used for.
Yeah, these things will come in cycles. That seems to be how history repeats itself.
Yeah.
in one form or another, and right now we're sort of in a renaissance where these things are coming back, and hopefully we'll develop good ways to use them. And the other part, the other approach, the other discourse on it is sort of this medical model, right? Which is to say, we don't trust the general public with these things. We don't trust the general public with their own minds and what they're capable of. So we'll leave it in the hands of professionals only, and they'll be the gatekeepers of these magical substances.
Kind of like a monopoly, basically, on it.
Sort of, yeah. And part of that is there's two sides to that coin as well. On the one hand, it's legitimate in the sense that we do need someone who can diagnose contraindications to these things, and like knows better and can help people navigate these experiences and use them for maximum therapeutic benefit. And then the other side of that, there's also like a lot of people chomping at the bit to find ways to make money on that, because that's the society we live in, and how do we exploit these things for profit? And there's companies that have been created, there's people working on this, and it makes me a little bit nervous. I don't know exactly how they would go about doing it, because you can't put a patent on nature, but you can. This is even a legitimate criticism of MAPS itself. They're getting a patent on their MDMA treatment protocol. So I think it's 5 years. For 5 years, no one else will be able to do MDMA therapy, at least not the way they're doing it, except for those who have gone through their training program. Is that right? I mean, they're putting in a ton of money to get the research out there, and it's only 5 years, and they just are trying to recoup maybe some of their their costs and expenses and whatever. So it's I want to be fair, and knowing how the world actually works, and money makes the world go round, so they say. But I'm just nervous that corporate interests will come in and corrupt this whole thing, and I hope that doesn't happen. I don't think it ultimately could, or at least it couldn't get much worse than the way it's been, because mushrooms will always grow. You can't stop them. You can't really effectively stop people from growing them, or from making ayahuasca, or for that matter, you can't really shut people down from making MDMA and LSD even. Those things have been around forever. I don't know firsthand, but apparently they're not terribly difficult to make. The recipes are out there, and people can make them, and they will, whether they're legal
allowed
or not.
to or not. That's the whole
right.
argument against the war on drugs, is like, was it even effective for what it was trying to do?
Right.
Probably not
so
even.
much. So, it's, I don't know. I kind of feel pulled in multiple directions. I think ultimately we need responsible legalization. And for me personally, I feel really called to help people who need help the most in the mental health world. And so I don't really want to treat a bunch of psychonauts who just want to become 1 degree more enlightened. I really want to help the people who are really can't find a solution to their depression or get over their trauma, and who just want something that works. Those are the people I want to help. And I almost prefer them to not have a psychedelic experience, because sometimes that can work against you a little bit. But yeah, so I just want to help you. And so, like, as a clinician, I feel fairly certain that I'll find a path to do that. Whether these become legal in one way or the other. But if that's not the ultimate best for society, that's debatable.
Yeah. And they're a great tool, but of course there's always so many different methods. There's always that kind of argument, even within those psychonaut enlightened circles, of, well, meditation is the truest path because it's more lasting. It's not just transient, and it's something that you do on your own. And then there's the other aspect that comes more out of shamanism, and that those substances are tools to teach you that. So regardless of what happens, there's always some way to help the mind and get that discovery with a substance or without. That's why it's interesting in the history of shamanism. There's certain cultures that never really use substances, and others that almost exclusively only use substances for their shamanic healing work. So where can people find you? And what's your website?
Yeah, so I've got drmatthewhicks.com. That's is up and live right now. And I'm also, like I said, developing this ketamine clinic, and that's going to be called Synaptic. And so we haven't built the website. Yeah, thank you. We haven't built the website yet, but the web address is going to be synaptic.care. So that'll be up here soon. And then I have my own podcast called Integrative Psychiatry Review, where I talk about all things mental health. Certainly there's several episodes on psychedelics in there. And yeah, that's where I'm available.
Excellent. Well, there you have it, Dr. Matthew Hicks. Thank you for the conversation. I always love talking about psychedelic therapies. I think there's really a future in this, and I'm so excited to see all the research that's moving towards it, and just the general acceptance that's starting to spread, where it's becoming less of a taboo subject. I even saw a Netflix movie, which was basically stories of different comedians talking about their psychedelic trips, and celebrities. What is it called? Like Thanks for Tripping or something like that?
Yeah, I don't remember the title, but I watched it. Yeah, it's pretty funny.
Yeah, right. And it was light, but it was also had some good information in it. But it made me very happy, because when I was watching it and I saw that it was like number 8 or something that day on Netflix, I was like, this is something is changing, like something in the air is changing, that a movie basically just about psychedelics and people using them is top 10 in the whole country. So that's where it's moving. And Oregon would probably be one of the first places. I mean, we tend to be pretty progressive when it comes to things of that nature, especially with, recreational cannabis and everything. So it's probably just a matter of time. But I think, who knows what will happen? Maybe it will be like, there'll be like a psilocybin tablet, and, it'll be patented, and then they'll have that whole model in insurance. But as you said, those medicines are part of nature and they grow everywhere, and you can patent it all you want, but it's still, going to be there to some extent. So the medicine's always there for people to make their own choices with their life, So thank you for being on the Herbal Hour podcast. And I would love to actually have you on again to talk more. I'm very fascinated in mental health in general. So thank you.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks for having me.